October 1944, the Gothic line, northern Italy. A German observation post had been watching a terraced vineyard since first light, not watching the road near it, not watching the farm track below it, watching the vineyard itself. 3 narrow terraces, 2 low stone walls. Rows of cut vines and gray olive trunks on a slope so bare that the officer in charge had already marked it on his sketch as unsuitable for concealment. At 0718, his battalion adjutant stepped from a doorway 70 meters behind the line. He folded before anyone heard the echo leave the valley. The shot had come from the vineyard. That was the impossible part. The German post had seen no man enter it, no branch move, no dust rise, no glint of glass, no cloth against the stone, no shadow that did not belong there. Within minutes, a patrol was sent across the terraces. They found no rifle, no spent casing, no clear track out. Only a shallow body mark pressed into dry earth beneath a broken vine, 2 small dents where elbows had held weight, and a handful of thyme crushed so flat it had become the color of the ground around it. The report did not call the shooter brave. It did not call him lucky. It said something colder. The concealment used by the British sniper did not conform to any method German observers had been trained to recognize. And that sentence was almost right. Because the man in that vineyard was not merely using British infantry doctrine. He was using something older than the war around him, older than the rifle in his hands, older than the uniform on his back. To understand why German observers kept staring at empty ground and missing the men inside it, you have to go back 30 years to the Western Front and to a British army that had entered a modern sniper war without knowing it was in one. In 1914, the German army understood sniping as a system: selected marksmen, telescopic sights, prepared hides, target priorities, officers first, NCOs next, anyone who looked like he was carrying orders after that. The British Army had excellent riflemen in the old infantry sense, but it had no comparable sniper system at start of the war, no standard sniper school, no serious issue of scoped rifles, no deep culture of camouflage for selected individual killing. In parts of the British officer class, sniping was still spoken of as something ungentlemanly, something too close to murder, something irregular soldiers did from behind rocks. Then the trenches gave their answer. A lieutenant raised binoculars over a parapet and died before he could call the range. A sergeant leaned toward a runner with a written message and was shot through the face. A captain lifted his map for 1 second too long, and a German bullet found him, because rank has a way of showing itself even when the badge is hidden. In the first 6 months of the war, British officers and NCOs were killed or wounded by German snipers in numbers remembered around 1,400. Not just men. The men who kept units working. The men who read maps, corrected lines, relayed orders, steadied frightened platoons, and made the difference between a trench full of soldiers and a unit that could still act. And for a long time, the British answer was not enough. Keep your head down. Use a periscope. Do not show yourself. That advice kept some men alive. It did not solve the problem. Because the real problem was not that German snipers could shoot. The real problem was that British soldiers could not find them. They looked for a man. The sniper had become a patch of bank, a fold of sackcloth, a shadow behind torn grass, a rifle muzzle hidden where the eye expected mud. The British Army had to learn a skill it had not valued, and the man who forced that lesson into shape was not a career infantry theorist. His name was Hesketh-Prichard, a writer, an explorer, a big game hunter, a man who had spent years learning that open ground is never actually open to the eye that understands it. He had stalked animals that survived by seeing movement before men believed they had made any. He knew 2 things most staff officers did not. First, a human body is visible for reasons. It moves, it shines, it cuts a line that nature does not cut. It casts a shadow that does not match the rest of the slope. It takes a position because the mind calls that position useful, and useful places are the first places another trained mind searches. Second, invisibility is not a trick. It is a discipline, not magic. Discipline. A man can be taught to stop arguing with the landscape. He can be taught to break his outline, to read wind, to crawl through dead ground, to use the color already present instead of the color a quartermaster gave him, to wait until his own body feels less like a body and more like another object the earth has already accepted. Hesketh-Prichard fought for that idea until the army had to listen. By 1916, at Lingham in northern France, the First Army School of Scouting, Observation, and Sniping began turning desperation into method. But the school's real power did not come from paperwork. It came from the men he brought into it. Highland stalkers, gamekeepers, gillies, men who had spent their working lives guiding hunters across Scottish hillsides, where a red deer could detect a wrong movement hundreds of meters away. A gillie did not think of concealment as a blanket thrown over a man. He thought of it as a negotiation with the ground. What color is the hill at this hour? Which tuft is moving in the wind and which one is still? Where does the ridge hide a crawling body for 3 seconds? Then expose it for 1. What does the animal expect to see, and what will make it look twice? That knowledge became military. The ghillie suit was not born as a parade garment. It was fieldcraft made wearable. Strips of rough material, natural vegetation, shape broken into clutter, human geometry dissolved into the messier grammar of grass, heather, bracken, and earth. At Lingham, soldiers learned to shoot, but more importantly, they learned to see. They learned to build hides, to use dummy heads, to identify loopholes, to read a hedge not as a hedge, but as a row of small decisions. To understand that the enemy sniper was not usually hidden by a large object. He was hidden by 10 small truths working together. A dark patch that should have been darker, a fresh cut in old grass, a sandbag edge just too straight, a bird that did not settle where birds had been settling all morning. By 1917, the German advantage that had felt absolute in 1914 was no longer absolute. British snipers began killing German snipers in the very places those men believed had made them safe. The hunter had learned to hunt the hunter, and then the war ended. The school closed. The urgency vanished. The men who understood the lesson were scattered back into civilian life, colonial posts, estates, regiments, and retirement. Institutions forget differently from people. A man remembers the bullet that took his captain. An institution remembers what it is inspected for. Between the wars, the British Army remembered drill, order, mobility, imperial policing, mechanization, budgets, and the shape of the next expected war. It did not remember sniping with the same fear, so the knowledge thinned. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough. By 1939, much of what had been learned at such cost had become a specialist memory living in pockets rather than a reflex across the army. And when British troops met German troops again, the old lesson returned with teeth. The darkest part of this story is not that Britain had once been unprepared. Armies are often unprepared for the first shape of a new war. The darker truth is that Britain had paid for the answer in blood, built a system to answer it, proved the system worked, and then allowed the answer to fade because peace made it look unnecessary. The dead had bought a tradition. The living nearly misplaced it, but not everyone forgot. In Scotland, the Highland estates had not forgotten how to stalk. In the Lovat scout tradition, recruited originally from gillies, gamekeepers, stalkers, and hillmen, the old fieldcraft still had a military name. Across the empire, officers and soldiers had spent years in country where European assumptions about ground were useless. Indian scrub, African bush, Palestinian wadis, Malayan jungle edges, rock thorn, elephant grass, dry riverbed, broken hill. Terrain that punished a man who believed concealment always looked like cover. When the sniper schools came back into importance during the Second World War, the rebuilt training did not begin from nothing. It reached backward, back to Hesketh-Prichard, back to Lingham, back to the Highland gillie, back to the animal stalker's old rule. The ground is not empty because you see no man. It is empty only if you know how that ground would look with a man inside it. That difference is the whole story. German military training was formidable. German observers knew how to watch lanes, tree lines, ruins, ridges, doorways, upper windows, embankments, shell holes, and the obvious folds of country. They knew how to register likely firing points. They knew how to punish movement. They knew how to turn exposed ground into a killing space. But British scout snipers trained in this older inheritance were being taught a different question. Not where is the cover? Where is the pattern weak enough to accept a man? A vineyard terrace, a wheat stubble field, a wadi bed, an olive grove, a stone wall with weeds at the base. A ditch that was too shallow to be cover and just deep enough to erase the line of shoulders. They were not being trained to disappear behind the ground. They were being trained to disappear into the way the ground already looked. That is why the reports sounded so strange. The Germans were not stupid. They were not careless. They were not facing ghosts. They were facing men who had been taught to use a category the observer had not fully named. Stillness, texture, outline, wind, patience, natural disorder. In Normandy, in Italy, in North Africa, and along the slow, grinding roads of the campaign in Europe, British and Commonwealth snipers used those things in ways that often looked impossible from the receiving end. A man crossed a patch of broken country without a sentry seeing him cross. A shot came from a slope that had been watched for an hour. A patrol swept the area afterward and found only a flattened scrape of earth, a few cut stems, the faint print of cloth, and the awful realization that the shooter had been closer than anyone believed. That was the psychological damage, not the bullet alone. The bullet killed one man. The disappearance trained 10 others to mistrust their own eyes. After enough of those incidents, every empty fold of ground became suspect. Every weed clump had to be studied. Every shadow had to be doubted. Every open patch became less open. That is how Fieldcraft becomes more than a technique. It becomes pressure. It forces the enemy to spend attention everywhere, and attention is one of the first resources war consumes. Now return to the terraced vineyard in Italy. The German observer had made a rational assessment. The slope was exposed. The terraces were narrow. The stone walls were low. The vines had been cut. The ground offered no cover that matched his definition of cover. So he watched for a man entering. He watched for movement, for a helmet, for a rifle, for the wrong line against the stone. What he did not read was the shallow run of shadow beneath the broken vine. He did not read the time and dust flattened in a direction the morning wind could not have made. He did not read the little dead angle between two terrace lips where a crawling man could stop, wait, and become part of the slope before the binoculars arrived. The British sniper did not beat that observation post because he was invisible in a supernatural sense. He beat it because the observer was watching for a soldier, and the sniper had been trained to become a disturbance too small to be called one. That training had passed through many hands. From Highland estates to the Boer War, from Lovat scouts to the Western Front, from Hesketh-Prichard's school to the scattered men who kept the memory alive. From Game Trail, Deer Hill, Thorn Bush, and Trench Line into the scout-sniper sections of another world war. A German officer could write that the method did not match British infantry doctrine he recognized. But that was because the deepest part of the method had never belonged entirely to the infantry manual. The manual gave it a name. The tradition gave it eyes. The Second World War was not decided by snipers and vineyards. It was decided by armies, factories, convoys, aircraft, artillery, fuel, code-breaking, command failures, and the enormous weight of nations. But war is also made of moments small enough to fit under a vine. One man looks at a hillside and sees empty ground. Another man looks at the same hillside and sees how to enter it. One army trains its observers to dominate the visible. Another teaches a few of its soldiers to live inside the overlooked. That is why the German reports kept circling the same problem. We watched the field. We saw nothing enter. We searched it afterward. We found almost nothing. They were telling the truth. They had been watching the ground. The British sniper had been reading it.